Okay, let's have a look at game 9 from the World Championship match. So d4 was played by Anand, who was white, so knight f6, c4 and then e6, indicating a willingness to go into the Nimzo-Indian defence. And the usual move both players have been playing has been knight f3. So here it was a pleasant surprise for spectators and everyone else that Anand varied with knight c3. So adding more excitement perhaps to this game than knight f3 could have. So bishop b4, we have the classic Nimzo-Indian. After the great thinker Aaron Nimzovich, who wrote My System, he talked about double pawns and restraints, and this was one of the specific opening systems that arose from those general considerations. Here is the potential for black to damage white's pawn structure, double the pawns, maybe fix these weaknesses later, with moves like c5 and establish c4 as a permanent weakness. Aaron Nimzovich, he won many games with this system, and it's still popular today, the Nimzo-Indian, as one of the most respected opening systems for black. So anyway, e3 was played, and I believe this is the Rubinstein variation. So Rubinstein, one of the strongest players of Nimzovich's era, although never world champion, he'd beaten quite a few of the strongest players of his time. A very solid positional plan, very good tactically as well. Some beautiful masterpieces from Rubinstein. And this variation with e3, so it hems in the bishop, but is a logical move supporting the centre. The bishop's often a tactical target if it went to g5 anyway. So this is still a respectable system today. One of the most common choices against Nimzo. So black castled. Now bishop d3. Okay, so bishop d3 interferes a bit with d4 control, and Topalov, he strikes now at d4 by playing c5. Now after knight f3, you'll see white's not worried about bishop c3 and doubling the pawns. He doesn't want to waste time with bishop d2 or even queen c2 here. He's inviting black to double his pawns. So Topalov plays d5, and we have a lot of central tension here. At any point now, white can end up potentially with an isolated queen's pawn, which has its own advantages and disadvantages. In fact, after white castles now, black uses the option to give white the isolated queen's pawn. So that's a very interesting pawn structure in its own right. So after cd, ed, black plays d takes c4. So we have this isolated queen's pawn, which a lot of theory has been written about. In a nutshell, the isolated queen's pawn gives white a nice pivot point on e5, gives white this semi-open e file. Black, on the other hand, if he can set up a blockade on d5 in particular, this could be looking weaker and weaker towards the endgame. And combined with that, black often combines c file pressure on that shared c file. So with white's outpost points on e5, white usually has the potential for an attack on this diagonal in particular is more sensitive than usual. h7 in particular. And it depends, if white can get rooks in. There's been some beautiful games from white, but there's been some positional, often positional wins from black, strangulating white using d5. So we can say it's double-edged and exciting. So b6 was played here. Immediately, targeting that d5 blockade square. Bishop g5 now. It's quite appropriate here to add more pressure to black's king side. Bishop b7, now rook e1, seizing that semi-open file, putting pressure on e5 and e6 potentially. Sometimes in these lines, there's sacks on f7 to damage this diagonal. A lot of tactical possibilities often emerge. So knight bd7. Rook c1, so that's an interesting move. White usually wants to have a battery on h7, a rather crude looking battery. Crudeness is more appropriate here. White's structurally worse with the isolated queen's pawn, so gaining an attack and build up on the king side is more appropriate. Often moves like queen d3, bishop going back behind the queen, stuff like that happens in this kind of position. Rook c1, the purpose of that though, if the case of the bishop ever goes to b1, at least the rook is ready to fight, and maybe come out later, if appropriate, on c3 if they're ever given the opportunity. So it's not hemmed in so much on a1, so that might be the point. Rook c8, and now bishop d3. So in fact the bishop's coming this way, maybe it's going to be tucked on b1. So the rook's outside, you know, ready to be on the c file for operations. Rook e8, and now queen e2. No bishop b1s. In fact, this move introduces other strategic ideas. A stronger grip on e5. Maybe black's last move, in fact, rook e8 was preparing e5. Also, white maybe wants to exchange off the light squared bishops, if appropriate, to try and weaken these light squares. But I'm not actually convinced by that here at the moment. So here, Topalov, he decided to play bishop takes c3, obviously not doubling white's pawns, but in fact just strengthening his grip on the light squares in the centre. So b takes c3, queen c7 was played now. So at the moment black's holding up on bishop f6, you can just recapture with the other knight. So here Anand plays an interesting move, bishop h4. So he's going to be attacking that queen maybe on that diagonal now with bishop g3. And now a very interesting knight on the rim move from Topalov is dim, but not in this position. Perhaps if Topalov plays it, it's 28.05. He knows when to break rules and generalizations. So what's going on here? Knight h5. Well, it's eyeing that f4, which the white's last move has just released control of f4. If bishop g3, maybe black just gobbles up the dark squared bishop with knight takes. And it's also inviting bishop h7. I think bishop h7 is unsound here, the Greek gift, as it's called. This wouldn't really work. I think knight g5, king g6, and black's got too much control of this position for this to work. You know, where's the follow-up? So that's to be avoided, bishop h7. So instead, Anand plays quite an interesting looking move, knight g5. So hitting h7, which I mentioned before is a crude, often targeted goal in this system. But here, you know, it's not quite isolated queen's pawn anymore. But even so, white still has some potential pressure on black's king side. So Topalov replied with g6. And now we have an awkward looking move here. I mean, this was a concession which sort of justified knight g5, weakening these dark squares a little bit more. Black hasn't got the dark squared bishop, so that's a good concession for Anand to gain. But now this awkward looking knight h3 allows Topalov the seemingly liberating move e5. Is he not just going to get a lot of active pieces now after e5? Well, Anand actually plays a move to try and reroute this knight perhaps. He plays f3 and also offering an imbalanced possibility if black wants to take on d4 for white to have to sack the queen. But in general that would favour the person, you know, grabbing the two rooks. Two rooks are slightly better in the general case, but in specific situations there's often a coordination difficulty if one has the two rooks against the queen. In fact, later in this game, I think we were able to see this imbalance. So queen d6, bishop f2, and in fact, Topalov decides to go for this imbalance. So the two rooks sacrifice just to win white's queen. So e takes d4, and Anand plays queen e8. So we have a very interesting situation now emerging. So Anand takes on d4. So the big questions now, can he coordinate properly, effectively, these two rooks to balance out the black queen? Can he also get this knight back into play? These are some issues to solve. The isolated queen's pawn has now re-emerged here, so black got potentially a good grip on d5, which will at least close in this bishop, hem in this bishop, and that pass pawn is dangerous potentially in its own right, would be nicely blockaded. On the other hand, you know, black's going to be careful not to allow the coordination of rooks under any circumstances. So casual moves like bishop d5 would fall miserably to like rook c8, for example. So black's got to be very careful here. Knight f6, attacking the rook moves. Knight e6, attacking d4. So what does white do about this? In fact, it will be awkward to try and defend d4 with rook c4. There's bishop a6, for example. So he plays actually bishop c4. He doesn't mind letting it go here. I mean, tactically, it's being refuted. I don't really want to turn on Rybka to check, but Topalov simply in this position plays bishop d5, establishing that nice blockade on d5. So bishop g3, hitting the queen. Queen moves. Now bishop e5. So the bishop's on a nice diagonal, piercing into those theoretically weak dark squares. Can anything emerge from that?